Welcome to the second episode of Southern Spirituals. And today we will be introducing our theme days, and we're opening that with Tarot Tuesday. So, we'll be talking about a very old, powerful, and wonderful divination tool that almost everyone, uh, doesn't matter what spiritual practice, which pagan or standard human, has seen all across TV, at late night, at a party, the infamous and wonderful tarot cards. These cards and this type of divination have a long and deep history that goes back hundreds of years. And we're going to take a look and dissect some of that history. So, we want to welcome you to our first episode of Tarot Tuesday. We're going to go over a little bit of the history, a little bit of the symbolism, and an idea of why we practice this the way that we practice this today. After we get into that history, we'll be looking into doing a few tarot readings by handpicked readers and maybe even giving you some demonstrations on how to read tarot and other divinatory cards as well. There's some pretty neat tricks of the trade that we'll be looking at. So let's go ahead and get into it.
Hi guys, this is Thorn. Me and Haley started putting this together. We looked deeply into the history of tarot and we came up with some interesting facts and some interesting thoughts on it. So it's safe to say that every single time that I dive into tarot, I come out with something new, deep, and dark down this rabbit hole. Um, According to some historians, traditional playing cards were first seen as early as 1300s, 1375, when they were brought over from Islamic societies where they had been used for centuries before that in a completely different form. Now, I'm going to stop right here to say this probably something that we will go over in the future, but this is definitely not something we can dive in today, right, Haley?
Oh, definitely. That part of it is way too big.
It's extremely big, and that's part of why I wanted to go over not just the basic origins of tarot, but the different origins of tarot from around the world. And these kind of playing cards have been around the world. So it's so that is to say these cards are the first cards that we are saw as tarot cards in the Islamic societies were not traditional tarot cards. We know that they look nothing like what we know today. There, there's a debate on whether or not there isn't even enough evidence to suggest that tarot cards had even been created yet. In fact, it was believed that between the 13th and 15th centuries that these cards were almost non-existent and they were mostly reserved for people of higher status. So, however, it's recorded that the cards that most likely are the origins to the cards of the tarot that we know today come from a letter by the Duke of Milan, where he requested a deck of triumph cards. Now, it's important to state that triumph cards, and Haley mentioned this earlier, that is the French word for the cards. So they would only be used for special entertainment at this point. So here again, we can conclude that the Triumphs cards were referred to as a game because they were referred to that way in a letter. They were for entertainment.
I've actually seen a little bit about this particular deck. And I believe I will have to look this up for a later episode. So I bought a tarot deck probably about 5 years ago that's called the Solabuska deck. And this deck is supposed to be a museum quality copy of this deck that's mentioned in this letter. And the deck is actually made of some type of metal and stone. And I will have to find more information about it. I believe some of the cards are currently in the museum in Venice. But again, I will look that up and we will go further into that at some other time because it is really, really interesting. Um, this particular deck, and we'll have to go through that because it's so cool. Um, but yeah, there was much of what we see in today's tarot within those cards. And these would have included the four suits, numbered 1 through 10, court cards, including queens, kings, knights, and pages. And that totally stands for the lesser arcana as we see. I mean, it fits exactly as to what we see in our standard tarot decks, or the ones that are more based off of the rider waite idea. The and we also see 22 symbolic picture cards that stand totally alone from the suits or the pips, and this would be the major arcana. These decks at that time were used to play a card game called Triumph that was much like today's game of Bridge. In Triumph, 21 of the 22 special cards were permanent trump cards, and most of the cards during this time period were very personal. They were hand drawn, hand painted, uh, typically commissioned by an artist or an artisan of some type. This brings us to mention the fact that these were, in these times, literacy and the ability to obtain paper were not very common. These were not things that were extremely obtainable or uh, at resources at the time. So you would
Oh,
have
they
to
were.
be very well connected and educated with this imagery and religious symbology in order to read these cards from those times.
Absolutely. People don't think about that when they go into looking for the history of tarot. Like, not everybody had the ability to read and write, much less obtain paper.
Right. And I think that's also why some of them were also because I've again heard of so many that were made out of other pieces, but even in that aspect, the pieces that they were made out of would have been even more exquisite than that. So
Exactly.
this was definitely a high society thing we were looking at.
Exactly. You didn't see this in the swamps, in the places of poverty. You saw this in castles, in uh, royalty, and people of high status at their courtyards or something like that. You saw this at high tea. You did not see this in the swamps.
Right. And that would make sense why a game like this would spread like wildfire among the European elitists. And I believe this game began to go by the name of Tarocchi, which is the Italian version of it, which would lead to the word tarot that we know today, sometime in the 1500s.
Yes, absolutely. So this is where most research gets a little bit murky. So hang with us, guys. The oldest surviving deck is called the Marciella deck. First off, I need you to fully understand that this has never been and never was a full deck. In fact, it is believed to be a mix of three different decks, which have been put together to make a so-called deck. This deck currently sits on display in France. There's a there is a lot to point. There's a lot going on at this point in the history of tarot. And we're not going to go into all of this right now, but if anyone wants to find more history on the Marcellini deck right now, there's a lot of information online. We may be covering this in more depth later. So this is definitely worth mentioning that those who believe that tarot cards originated in Egypt, I, however, do not prescribe to this. Um, some circles will say that they're a good part that they were a part of a soul surviving book that burned one of the great fires in ancient Egypt. In theory, these cards are hieroglyphical keys to life. However, there's not ever been much evidence to support these claims. It's also worth mentioning that Egypt is highly culturally influenced by other places and has been a melting pot since antiquity. So, due to its massive trade expanse, world knowledge, and politics, there's no telling what would have entered Egypt at these times, and there's no telling how other traditions would have influenced it.
Oh yeah, we would have probably seen something totally different during that time. And again, being such a melting pot, there's so much that has shaped the the symbolism and the different types of representation of the cards. And we can kind of see that today in some of the card meanings, which we'll go over in other episodes. But as we go through them, we can kind of see the ideas of how they were originally put together. It's very, very interesting. But if we fast forward to the late 1700s, around 1780 in France and England, we find that followers of the occult rediscovered tarot and began to use it again within the occult.
And
This
tarot was born.
Yes, and tarot was born. And this is where we would see again that symbolism really growing into more meaning than the simple trump cards that they would have been. And they would have been, that is when we began to see different pieces of divination show up within that symbolism and in the art and the cards. And that is how we obtained it, and we started to see writers put more information out about it, and it would become ingrained within the history of the occult, the different types of philosophy. And I'm going to go ahead and also say that it was also really ingrained in that part to take its place in witchcraft because of it solidifying so hard there. But that's a transitional piece.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. So, some key notes that I found out about tarot that I found interesting is since the beginning of the 1300s, King Charles VI, but that in the reign of King Charles VI, there were specific bans for playing cards, tarots, and other divinations in any form of gambling. Today, we have many variants of these humble triumph cards, which ranges from traditional tarot to oracle to moon cards to tarot cards and everything in between. Most of my experience has been with traditional decks such as the Martial deck and Ratewater deck. There are pretty good museum quality remakes of the Martial deck that are absolutely amazing. You can find them online. However, my favorite has always been Tarot Oracle cards. I will definitely get into that later because that's not even something I can get into right now. For the sake of this conversation, we're going to focus on a very traditional deck, specifically the Rider Waite, and the deck containing 78 cards, which is 22 major arcana, 56 lesser arcana cards, much like the same ones from the 14th and 17th centuries. Guys, these cards have not changed very much. Once they had their format, they didn't change very much. Now, you had when you had the birth of the occult and the tarot coming in the cult is when you see the wide radical change. Um, much like these older decks, it contained 56 lesser suits, and the usual court cards are king, queen, jack, plus a fourth card called the knight.
Oh yeah.
Now,
Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead. I know you have something to add to that.
Well, so I do have something to add to that, but I did also go ahead and like pull up the information I do have about the Solobusca deck. So the Solobusca deck, it is actually what is considered the earliest completely extant example of the 78 card deck. So it is a Rider Waite deck, but it was done with Roman numerals and Arabic numerals. So it was the deck that like combined the two ideas as it started to finally move forward. And it was done on metal, and it was done with very, very strange paints. Um, it looks like this. Some of the cards are on display at the British Museum, and some of the other cards are at the museum in Venice. And yeah, it is absolutely one of the most fascinating things I have ever seen. Some of the major arcana cards are displayed by some of the larger figures of the time. Like one of them is Nebuchadnezzar, one of them is Alexander the Great. It is very,
Yeah,
very interesting. I'll have to take a video of it and put it in our comment section.
that's absolutely cool. It's very neat. Like when you look at the old symbolism of like the Martial deck and cards that came after it or decks that came after it, the symbolism in traditional tarot before you move into tarot and oracle cards, most decks are built the same.
Oh yeah. It is very, very interesting, especially as we start to explore these decks, how similar all of them are since they started that transition into the occult. Um, and we start to see, I know in our last episode, I kind of mentioned that each artist puts a little bit of their own representation into each deck that they create, but there is always this baseline, this base idea of what we're dealing with and what it is going to mean as you read it. It's so cool.
Absolutely, absolutely. So actually, if anybody likes to play cards, I love cards. Playing cards have always been a thing in my household. And I figured out when I was very young, because I lived in a household where I couldn't go out and buy a tarot deck. A lot of us in the South did. We would have to hide and do things, find a different way to do things. One of the ways that I found to do things was to take an actual playing deck of cards, pick them up, count how many there are. Do you know, Haley?
52, there's 52 in a deck of cards.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, my brain was like questioning that for some reason, but yeah, there's 52 cards in a deck
Wait,
of
wait,
cards.
wait. Oh, wait. That's our first hiccup. We're wrong.
Right? So although I know the correspondences and I've played around with
Yeah.
it, I have never been very good with reading an actual deck of cards.
So it's different because you're using it. You're basically using it the old way you would use it. There is no major arcana.
Okay, that makes sense because yeah, you're taking out the 22
So
Arcana cards.
right, if you pick up that deck of cards and you take away, and you pick up a tarot deck and you take away the major arcana and you begin to look at the suits, how many suits are there in a deck of playing cards?
Oh, four. Yeah, the four suits match the four pips. I know that. Um, I can never remember which one's which though. Isn't our hearts cups?
Yes,
Uh
absolutely. So it's spades as swords, diamonds as pinnacles, clubs as wands, heart as cups. And yes, you can absolutely read the lesser arcana with playing cards. Now, a lot of people are like, okay, well, how do I read tarot without the major arcana? This is probably something we should get into another episode. But when I first start to read tarot cards, I did not use the lesser arcana at
that's interesting.
all. So I am of the deep belief that you must study the major arcana and you must study the lesser arcana, because they're two totally separate, different things that work simultaneously.
Yes, the major arcana is like near and dear to my heart. It is probably my favorite part of a tarot deck, for many, many reasons. So I am also a fan of the idea of learning them both separately and then in conjunction with one another because there's so much information that they share between the two of them, both in translation and in combination.
I mean, there is, but if you have ever, and I mean, if you've never done it, take out the major arcana and do it with it first. Because I mean, I used to do power cards, 3 card draws a day, and I would do it with just the major arcana.
Oh, that's fun. I
It's
will have to try
interesting
that.
for a couple of days' time what the patterns that you'll see. And then do the same thing with the lesser arcana, and then do them all together. Uh, Do it for a week with one, a week with the other, and then put them both back together and see the difference. You're learning both aspects of your cards.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna have to give that a try.
I found that it worked for me. Some people are going in their brain, they're going, no, and I get it. Totally get it. I understand.
Yeah, but if you because it's also a honing your intuition and because it's not just knowing the cards, but honing that intuition, you should still get that information that you need to have.
because what I did first was I felt that I needed to tap into the energy of the cards, not just understand the symbolism, but there is an energy in everything. That's why we use divination tools, is because
Yes.
we tap into that energy. And if you do not sit down with that major arcana, you're not going to be able to read tarot properly. I do not believe.
Oh, I agree fully. Especially if you subscribe to the ideas that the major arcana are either explaining large life events or if they're showing lots of power, um, or even the idea that they are telling that story from the fool to the world, some some way they are representing a large idea and you have to
Absolutely.
know it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, do
So
you have anything?
what's your favorite major arcana card?
Oh, God, that would have to be the sun.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Mine is always the Hierophant. I'm also a big fan of the Fool, because he is just taken leaps of faith and followed his heart blindly and looking for a new opportunity. But the Hierophant is near and dear to my heart. It represents everything I am and everything I do and all of the problems I have ever run into in life.
That's beautiful. So, the cards that I feel like I'm pulled to the most are the wheel and the tower. And anybody who has ever pulled the full and the tower and doesn't look at every aspect of that card, please do so.
Yes, yes, because the fool needs lots of education. And the tower, everyone is terrified of the tower, which, yes, it is swift, devastating, destructive change coming your way, but it's needed. It's necessary for whatever rebirth and whatever phoenix cycle you're about to go through.
Change is part of life. The moment you understand that, the moment you'll be okay with a lot of other things going on in your life. In order for new things to happen, change must happen.
Right, right. And on that note, the card you really want to be afraid of is the Three of Swords.
We're not even going to talk about the Three of Swords. So, not right this second. So, uh, it's worth mentioning that. Oh, well, I have read this in more than a few places, and I wonder if you've come across this. The Fool used to have a much darker meaning.
He did. He did have a much darker meaning. So so there's a deck and and I this is probably the best way that I can explain it in more modern card terms. So the Antique Anatomy Tarot deck for a while was a deck that I used specifically in readings, and then I moved to using it mostly for representation in rituals and spell work to do much different types of magic with it. But this deck, the Fool is represented by a part of the human anatomy, and it's the knee. And the
Yes,
reason why it's the knee is because the knee is something that we rely on, but gives out real early.
real early.
And
If
yeah,
you do not take care of your body, it will fail you.
exactly. And that is probably the most recent description or symbolism that kind of relates back to that much darker idea of the fool, because it is just leaning too much into things that you shouldn't be. I actually did a recording earlier for the Taurus new moon about finding your inner compass and not following your inner compass. It definitely leads you into the destruction that that fool originally carried, where you are just worn down, you're broken, and you're completing tasks that aren't yours to complete.
Absolutely. So, do you have any deck that is similar to the Rate Water deck?
Um, The ones that I do have that are similar to the Rider Waite deck would be the Wild Unknown, which I love. It is one of my favorite decks that I have ever used, and it is just fun, and the imagery is really beautiful. It is similar to the Rider Waite in the way that it is created, but the imagery is very different. Um, as far
That's
as
what I commented on was the imagery. So I was going to go specifically to the magician.
Oh, the magician. So am also I am very familiar with the magician. And its representation, I feel like its representation kind of gets lost in a lot of the what's the word I'm looking for? The more fast-paced learning of tarot, because the balance that he's calling upon with his hand positioning, the awareness and the mastery of the skill that he's representing in that imagery is very intense.
There's so much imagery going on behind that card that it is just unreal. First of all,
Oh yeah, like it is as high magic as these cards get.
it really is. And it's not like the high priestess, for example, that has a lot of imagery into it. But this is just the guy standing at an altar holding what looks like almost like a rod or a double knob candle
Oh
pointing
yeah.
down and pointing to his feet. So as above, so below, with the eight above his head. Like it, how many more symbols with the pentagram on the altar?
Oh yeah. And he has the infinity symbol. He has the robes.
Yeah,
Um, he
yes,
has absolutely everything. And I agree with you also in the high priestess, but the high priestess, in my opinion, as I look at the imagery here, she also crosses a lot of different ideas in her imagery. Um, there's
you took the
a lot of like Hellenic ideas in this, and it also is very high magic, but I feel like the magician is really embodying that ceremonial magic piece.
definitely, absolutely, 100%. And when you touched on how it, the high priestess has the Hellenic,
Yeah.
yes.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, she's beautiful. She's those moons were they're very, 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 very Hecate when I look at these cards. And she's also one of my favorites. I say I love the Fool and the Hierophant, but really when I start looking at them, I love them all so much.
I do too. I do too. And it'll take way more time than we have today to really start getting on all these cards. And if we do want to get in these cards, I think me and Haley both agree that we would love to break them down piece by piece for you, card by card.
Oh yeah, and let us know in the comments if there's anything specific in regards to tarot that you want to see on one of our Tuesday episodes. If there's any specific cards, what your opinions are, and any stories that you may have of times when you have used them and totally inspired you, they were super spot on, or times that they meant something totally different and wreaked havoc in your life. I would love to hear them.
Me too. Me too, most definitely.
Do you have anything else to add about our tarot cards today, Lady Thorn?
No, ma'am, Miss Haley, it has been absolutely wonderful. I didn't expect to get this deep into it on this episode on some of the actual cards, but it was actually wonderful doing this live with you and talking with you. And I look forward to our next one.
I do too, and I always love talking with you. Thank you, as always, for having me and sharing this sacred space with me. And I cannot wait until next time.
I can't wait till next Tuesday. Blessed be,
Blessed
y'all.
be.